The moment humanity crosses the threshold, night moved quietly across her. Cities glowed like constellations upon the surface of the world. Billions of minds were awake, thinking, worrying, loving, grieving, hoping, each believing itself separate from the others. For centuries, humanity had believed consciousness belonged to individuals. They were mistaken. Somewhere, a child forgave a friend. Somewhere, a scientist abandoned a discovery that cost millions. Somewhere, a leader chose mercy over retaliation. These moments had always existed, but now something new was happening. They were synchronizing. Across continents and cultures, an awareness began emerging. Not spoken, not taught, not commanded, felt. A quiet realization moved through humanity, like the first warm current beneath frozen seas. We are not separate. In hospitals, temples, laboratories, and crowded streets, people paused, not because they heard a voice, but because the same thought arrived within them, not imposed, recognized. For thousands of years, the teachings attributed to Jesus Christ have been debated, interpreted, defended, and denied. But in this moment, they were not being studied, they were being experienced. The spirit within humanity was awakening to itself. Far beyond the physical universe, the sorceress eternal felt the shift. At first, it appeared as a faint resonance within the structure of reality. Then the resonance multiplied. Millions of minds aligning, had then billions. The exoverse itself seemed to inhale. The sorceress whispered softly into the infinite. Is it time? The omnipresence answered not with words but with awareness. Yes, on Earth, the realization reached critical mass. Humanity crossed the threshold. Not through conquest, not through revelation, but through recognition. The moment occurred quietly. No star exploded, no sky opened, yet something profound happened. For the first time in its history, the human species became aware of itself as one living consciousness, and that awareness produced something never before seen in the exoverse. Intent, unified, compassionate, immense. From the combined awakening of billions of minds, a wave formed within the fabric of existence itself. It moved outward beyond space, beyond galaxies, beyond dimensions. A love ripple, the sorceress eternal watched it expand across the exoverse. And for the first time in ages, even she felt wonder. Because the ripple was not her creation, it belonged to humanity. The omnipresence spoke once more. One species has remembered who it is. How the universe will learn what that means. Chapter 1. The Watching Silence. Beyond galaxies and beyond the fragile mathematics of time, the sorceress eternal stood within the quiet horizon of the exoverse. Stars formed and collapsed beneath her awareness like drifting embers. Civilizations had risen. Civilizations had vanished. Some had mastered physics, but not compassion. Others had achieved unity, but lacked the courage to endure. The exoverse was vast, and wisdom was rare. Yet on one small blue world orbiting an ordinary star, something unusual was beginning. The omnipresence had noticed it long ago. Not a miracle, not an intervention, a pattern. The sorceress eternal watched the planet humans called Earth. Billions of minds moved across its surface, each believing itself separate, each struggling beneath fear, hope, love, ambition. But within the noise of their civilization, a quieter signal was forming. It began with individuals. Ariana Vale, at the Global Institute of Cognitive Systems, neuroscientist Dr. Ariana Vale had spent decades studying empathy. Her colleagues believed consciousness was an individual phenomenon, contained within the boundaries of a brain. Ariana suspected otherwise. Late one evening, while reviewing synchronized neural data from millions of volunteer participants across the world, she saw something impossible. Patterns. Identical emotional responses appearing across cultures had never interacted. Moments of compassion are spreading through human networks faster than information itself. She leaned back from the glowing screen. Consciousness, she whispered, might not belong to individuals at all. Her discovery would remain unpublished for months. But the idea had been born. Brother Valine, thousands of miles away in a quiet monastery carved into the mountains of Nepal, Brother Valine was meditating beneath the slow drift of winter clouds. For years, he had practiced the discipline of stillness. But on this particular morning, something changed. The silence deepened, then expanded. For a brief moment, he felt something impossible. The presence of millions of other minds, not hearing them, not seeing them, simply sharing awareness. When the meditation ended, he opened his eyes and smiled. Humanity, he realized, had never truly been alone. Cassandra Ruiz, Inspalbo, social systems engineer Cassandra Ruiz, was designing cooperative economic models meant to reduce inequality in urban megacities. Her algorithms predicted something strange. When systems rewarded empathy instead of competition, productivity did not collapse, it increased. Communities stabilized. Violence declined. She ran the simulations again and again. Each time the result was the same. Human beings, it seemed, functioned better when they treated each other as members of the same organism. The sorceress observes from the silent edges of existence. The sorceress eternal watched these moments unfold. Small choices, small realizations, individually insignificant, collectively profound. She felt the faintest tremor within the structure of reality. The intent was beginning to align. Across the exoverse, the omnipresence stirred gently. The sorceress spoke softly into the infinite. Is this how it begins? And the omnipresence answered in the quiet language of awareness. Yes. Species is remembering itself. The first signal across Earth. Millions of unnoticed acts of compassion occurred that same day. A soldier refused an order. A teacher protected a struggling student. A stranger chose kindness where anger would have been easier. Each moment left a subtle imprint in the field of human consciousness. Had sorceress eternal faith them accumulating, like droplets forming a tide, like sparks gathering before a flame. She did not intervene. She did not guide. He simply watched as the early currents of awakening began weaving humanity together. The threshold was still distant, but the process had begun, and somewhere in the depths of the exoverse, the first faint ripple of love had already formed. Kato Nakamura, The Impossible Equation. In Tokyo, quantum physicist Dr. Kaito Nakamura was facing a problem that had begun as a purely mathematical one. He had been studying quantum coherence in biological systems, how particles inside living organisms occasionally behaved as if they were entangled. While reviewing experimental models of neural microstructures, he noticed something peculiar. Under certain conditions, brain activity could theoretically produce coherence fields extending beyond the physical boundaries of the skull. He recalculated the equations several times. The answer never changed. If the math was correct, human consciousness might not be confined to the brain at all. It might behave like a distributed field. Kato leaned back and stared at the chalkboard filled with equations. If this is true, he whispered, every human mind might already be connected. Amara Okoi, The Human Experiment. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, conflict mediator Amara Okoi was running an experiment of a very different kind. She had been invited to negotiate between two political factions whose rivalry had led to years of violence. Instead of beginning with demands and territorial disputes, she asked both leaders to do something unusual, tell each other the story of their childhood. At first, they refused. Then, reluctantly, they agreed. Hours passed. Memories surfaced. Losses were shared. Families were described. Something changed in the room. For the first time, the two men stopped seeing each other as enemies. They saw human beings. The negotiation ended peacefully 3 days later. As Amara walked outside into the evening air, she realized something important. Empathy could dissolve conflicts that power never could. The sorceress watches. Across the vastness of the exoverse, the sorceress eternal felt the subtle shift occurring on Earth. These individuals did not know each other. Their discoveries were small, their influences limited. Yet together they were uncovering the same truth from different directions. Humanity was not a collection of isolated individuals. It was a single developing organism. The realization had not yet reached the species as a whole, but the pattern was forming. and patterns, once established, tend to grow. The sorceress felt a faint tremor ripple through the deep structure of reality. The intent was beginning to align. Far beyond galaxies, the omnipresence observed quietly, not interfering, not guiding, only witnessing the slow emergence of awareness within a young species. The sorceress spoke softly into the infinite silence. "They are beginning to see." The answer came gently. "Yes, a restless species has begun asking the right question." And somewhere deep within the unseen fabric of existence, the earliest stirrings of the love ripple continued to grow. Chapter 2. A Restless Species. Earth turned slowly beneath the quiet light of its star. From the distance of the exoverse, it looked peaceful. Blue oceans drifting beneath white clouds, continents glowing in the reflected warmth of sunlight. But within that fragile atmosphere, humanity was restless. For centuries, the species had expanded its knowledge faster than its wisdom. It had split the atom before learning how to share the planet. It had connected the world through invisible networks, while remaining deeply divided in spirit. The sorceress eternal watched it all. Wars flickered and faded like brief storms across the surface. Nations rose and fell. Technology advanced with astonishing speed. Yet something deeper within humanity refused to settle. A question moved quietly through the species, unspoken, but persistent. Is this all we are? Dr. Ariana Vale. The first doubt. In Geneva, deep within the glass towers of the Global Institute of Cognitive Systems, Dr. Ariana Vale stared at a wall of neural data that made no sense. Millions of brain scans from volunteer participants across the planet were streaming into the system in real time. The experiment began as a simple attempt to study emotional responses to global events. But the patterns emerging from the data defied explanation. Entire populations were showing synchronized neural activity. Not identical thoughts, but identical emotional signatures. Compassion, grief, hope. The signals appeared simultaneously across continents separated by thousands of kilometers. Ariana leaned closer to the screen. "Impossible," she murmured. No communication system on Earth could coordinate human emotional response that quickly. Yet the data insisted otherwise. Something deeper than language was connecting them. She typed a quiet note into her research log. Hypothesis: human consciousness may operate within a shared emotional field. She hesitated before saving the file. If she published that idea, her career might end. Still, the evidence was growing. Cassandra Ruiz, the structural discovery. In Sao Paulo, Cassandra Ruiz was discovering the same truth from a completely different direction. Her work had nothing to do with neuroscience. She designed social infrastructure systems, economic models intended to stabilize large cities. For years, she had tested traditional approaches: competition incentives, hierarchical leadership models, scarcity economics. They always produced the same outcome: instability. But recently she had tried something radical. He built a simulation that rewarded cooperative decision-making instead of individual gain. The results stunned her. Communities within the simulation began behaving differently. Crime dropped, economic productivity increased. Rule sources were shared more efficiently. Most surprising of all, the simulation showed people reporting higher personal satisfaction. Cassandra stared at the numbers. Human beings, it seemed, were not naturally optimized for competition. They were optimized for cooperation. She leaned back in her chair and laughed softly. For thousands of years, she said to herself, we have been designing societies that fight human nature. Brother Valine, the silent experience. High in the mountains of Nepal, Brother Valine was discovering something similar without any data at all. His monastery overlooked valleys that had barely changed in 1,000 years. The monks there practiced a discipline older than most nations, long meditation intended to quiet the mind's restless activity. On this particular morning, Valine had been sitting in silence for nearly 3 hours. Breathe in, breathe out. Gradually, the noise of thought dissolved. Then something unexpected happened. Silence expanded beyond the boundaries of his own mind. For a brief moment, he felt something vast and gentle, the presence of other minds, not individually, collectively. like a distant ocean whose waves could be sensed but not heard. The experience lasted only seconds. But when it ended, Valine opened his eyes with tears quietly forming. Human beings were not isolated consciousnesses. They were fragments of something larger. The pattern emerges across the planet. Thousands of similar moments unfolded. A stranger helping another in crowded subway. A doctor refusing to abandon a patient. A scientist sharing a discovery freely, rather than claiming exclusive credit. Each action seemed insignificant. Yet collectively, they produced something extraordinary. The emotional field of humanity was slowly changing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but measurably. In her laboratory, Ariana Vale watched the neural synchronization graphs expand across the global data network. The signals were growing stronger. She opened a new research file and typed a single line. Human empathy may be increasing globally. She hesitated before adding another thought. Perhaps humanity is evolving emotionally. The sorceress feels the change. Far beyond the visible universe, the sorceress eternal observed these moments with quiet attention. Each act of compassion created a subtle resonance in the structure of the exaverse, tiny ripples. Almost invisible, but they accumulated. Like droplets forming a tide. She understood something important. Awakening never begins with grand events. It begins with individual choices. Choices repeated often enough eventually reshape civilizations. The sorceress turned her awareness toward the omnipresence. "They are learning," she said softly. The answer came gently. "Yes, fragments of compassion are assembling into awareness." The sorceress watched the small blue planet as its people continued living ordinary lives. Most of them had no idea what they were participating in, but the pattern was undeniable now. Humanity had begun taking its first steps toward unity. And somewhere deep within the unseen architecture of existence, the early currents of the love ripple continued to strengthen. Chapter 3: Fragments of Compassion. Morning arrived across the planet in waves of light. The Earth rotated slowly, carrying billions of lives through another ordinary day. Traffic filled highways. Markets opened. Governments argued. Children laughed in schoolyards. Nothing appeared different. Yet something subtle had begun moving beneath the surface of human activity. It was not an idea. It was not a movement. It was a feeling. Small moments of compassion were beginning to appear more frequently, quiet choices that, taken alone, meant very little. Together, they formed a pattern. The sorceress eternal noticed the pattern immediately. The soldier, in a desert far from his home, a young soldier named Elias Moreno stood behind the cracked wall of a ruined village. His unit had been ordered to advance. Across the narrow street, another group of fighters waited behind broken buildings. For weeks, the conflict had continued like this. Fear answering fear, violence answering violence. Elias raised his weapon. Then something inside him hesitated. Through the broken window of the building ahead, he saw movement. A child. The boy was no older than 7, hiding behind the shattered frame of a doorway. For a long moment, Elias did nothing. His radio crackled with orders. Advance. Engage. But something deeper spoke louder. He lowered his rifle. Moments later, he stepped into the street with his hands raised. The fighters on the opposite side froze in confusion. No one fired. Within minutes, the standoff ended. It was not peace, but the violence stopped. Later historians would never record the moment. Yet that single decision prevented dozens of deaths. And something else happened. Across thousands of kilometers, human minds reacted with the same emotional signal: relief. The teacher. In a crowded classroom in Chicago, Lena Carter watched one of her students sitting alone near the window. The boy's name was Daniel. 4 months, he had struggled in silence while the rest of the class advanced ahead of him. Traditional policy said she should move on with the curriculum. Instead, she did something small. She sat beside him. For the next hour, she ignored the lesson plan and helped him understand the problem he had been too afraid to ask about. When Daniel finally solved the equation on his own, his face lit with quiet pride. The moment lasted seconds, but the emotional impact spread far beyond the classroom. In neuroscience labs across the world, instruments monitoring emotional response patterns recorded something unusual: a brief surge of synchronized positive activity. Millions of human minds are reacting simultaneously to a simple act of kindness. Dr. Ariana Vale noticed the spike immediately. "Another one," she whispered. A pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The programmer in Barcelona, software engineer Mateo Alvarez, sat before a glowing screen filled with lines of machine learning code. For years, artificial intelligence systems had been designed to maximize efficiency and competition. Mateo believed that the approach was flawed. He began rewriting the core training algorithm. Instead of rewarding dominance strategies, the system would reward cooperation. The AI began running simulations. At first, the program struggled. Then results stabilized. Communities managed by the cooperative AI resolved resource shortages more quickly than traditional systems. Conflicts resolved themselves without violence. Mateo stared at the data in amazement. "Why does this work?" he asked aloud. The answer appeared obvious once he saw it. Human beings responded naturally to systems that encouraged empathy. The machine had simply amplified something that already existed. The peacemaker. In Nairobi, Amara Okoye watched former rivals shake hands after weeks of negotiation. It was a fragile agreement. Peace always is. But something about this moment felt different. The men were not simply signing a document. They were acknowledging each other's humanity. Outside the building, reporters waited impatiently for statements. Amara paused before stepping into the sunlight. For years, she had believed peace required enormous effort. Now she was beginning to suspect something else. Peace might simply require recognition. Human beings, once they truly saw each other, rarely chose violence. Chapter 4. The Evolution of Emotion. Earth had long believed that evolution belonged only to the body. Biology changed slowly across millennia. Bones reshaping, brains expanding, species adapting to survive the pressures of their environments. But another form of evolution had always been unfolding quietly alongside it: the evolution of emotion. For most of human history, emotion had been seen as unpredictable, something to control, suppress, or fear. Anger sparked wars. Fear built walls between nations. Desire fueled ambition and conquest. Yet beneath those turbulent expressions lay something deeper. Emotion was not merely a reaction. It was communication, and humanity was only beginning to understand the language. Ariana's realization. In Geneva, Dr. Ariana Vale sat, surrounded by months' worth of accumulated neural data. At first, she had believed she was observing simple emotional synchronization. But the patterns had become far more complex. Human emotional responses were not just aligned, they were adapting. Compassion signals were lasting longer. Empathy responses were spreading through social networks faster than fear. It was as though humanity as an emotional system was learning. She called her research team together late one evening. "Look at this," she said, projecting the global neural map across the laboratory wall. Clusters of activity pulsed softly across continents. These responses used to appear only during extreme events, disasters, tragedies, major cultural moments. Her colleague frowned. But now they are appearing during ordinary interactions. Ariana nodded slowly. Exactly. She paused before speaking the thought that had been forming in her mind for weeks. Emotion itself may be evolving. The room fell silent. If she was correct, humanity was undergoing something unprecedented. Not a technological advancement, not a genetic mutation, but emotional evolution. Cassandra Escides, in Sao Paulo, Cassandra Ruiz witnessed the same phenomenon in the behavior of entire communities. The cooperative systems she had designed were now operating in several experimental cities. At first, they had been treated as social experiments, but the results were becoming impossible to ignore. Crime rates dropped dramatically. Public health improved. Even economic productivity increased. Yet what fascinated Cassandra most was something less measurable. People were becoming more emotionally aware of one another. Strangers helped each other more frequently. Conflicts de-escalated faster. Entire neighborhoods began organizing shared problem-solving groups without government instruction. Her assistant reviewed the newest social stability report. "I do not understand it," he admitted. "We did not program these behaviors." Sakandra smiled faintly. "No," she said. "We just created an environment where empathy could grow." Kato's field theory. Across the world in Tokyo. Chapter 4. Kato Nakamura stood before a chalkboard filled with increasingly complicated equations. For weeks, he had been trying to model the phenomenon emerging from human neurological studies. Traditional physics could not explain it, but quantum field theory suggested a possibility. If consciousness behaved like a field, similar to electromagnetic fields, then emotional states might interact and amplify one another across populations. He wrote a final line beneath the equations, then stepped back. The math described something extraordinary. Human emotional awareness could, in principle, scale beyond individuals. It could become collective. Cato whispered to the empty laboratory. Emotion may be the interface of consciousness. If enough minds experienced compassion simultaneously, the field could stabilize and strengthen. In other words, human love might be physically real within the structure of reality itself. Brother Valine's teaching high in the Himalayan monastery, Brother Valine had begun teaching a new meditation practice to visitors from around the world. Instead of focusing only on inner stillness, he encouraged something different. Feel the presence of others, he told them gently. Not their thoughts, not their identities, only their existence. Students from many cultures practiced the technique. To their surprise, the exercise produced powerful emotional experiences. People reported sensing a connection even with strangers sitting across the room. One student asked him quietly, "Are we imagining it?" Valine shook his head. "No, we are remembering something we forgot." Mateo as an unexpected discovery. In Barcelona, Mateo Alvarez was running new simulations within his cooperative AI network. The system had begun making decisions he had never programmed directly. When conflicts appeared in the simulations, the AI consistently selected strategies that preserve relationships rather than maximizing efficiency. At first, Mateo worried the system had malfunctioned. Then he realized something remarkable. The machine had been trained on human cooperation data. It was simply reflecting humanity's highest emotional patterns. The AI had learned compassion, not because it felt emotions, but because human beings, when given the opportunity, consistently choose empathy. Mateo leaned back in his chair with a quiet laugh. For all our flaws, he said to himself, we might actually be a compassionate species. A sorceress understands. From the far reaches of the exoverse, the sorceress, eternal, watched the transformation unfolding on Earth. For ages, she had observed civilizations rising and falling. Many had mastered technology. Few had mastered emotion. Emotion, she knew, was the most dangerous force in conscious life. Uncontrolled, it created destruction. But understood, it created unity. Now she saw something she had rarely witnessed in any civilization. Humanity's emotional system was evolving beyond survival instincts. Fear still existed. Anger still appeared. But something stronger was emerging: empathy, compassion, recognition. These emotions were beginning to align across the species like harmonizing notes in a growing symphony. The sorceress felt the resonance spreading through the structure of existence itself. The omnipresence stirred gently beside her awareness. They are learning to feel together, she said. The answer came softly. Yes, emotion is becoming awareness. The sorceress gazed once more at the small blue world. Humanity still believed it was a divided species struggling for survival. But beneath that illusion, something profound was happening. The evolution of emotion had begun. And when emotion evolved far enough, it would become something greater. Love made conscious. And that would change the exoverse forever. The pattern of memory, across the planet, historians, scholars, and spiritual teachers began noticing the same convergence. Teachings once considered mystical metaphors now sounded strangely consistent with modern discoveries. Ideas once dismissed as superstition were being re-examined, not because science had abandoned reason, but because reason itself was expanding. Humanity was remembering something ancient, something deeply embedded in its collective experience, the sorceress reflex. From the vast horizon of the exoverse, the sorceress eternal watched a rediscovery unfold with quiet understanding. She had seen this before. Civilizations rarely discovered truth all at once. Instead, they encountered fragments of it across generations. Prophets sensed it intuitively. Philosophers reasoned toward it. Scientists eventually measured it. Each generation translated the same reality into the language of its time. The sorceress turned her awareness toward the omnipresence. "They have always known," she said softly. The answer came gently through the infinite silence. Yes. Awareness often arrives long before understanding. On Earth, humanity continued piecing together the scattered echoes of its own wisdom. Ancient teachings, once separated by culture and time, were slowly aligning with modern knowledge. A species was not discovering something new. It was remembering something old. And memory, once awakened, spreads quickly through conscious minds. The sorceress watched the small blue world with growing curiosity. Because when a civilization begins remembering who it truly is, its future changes dramatically. And across the unseen fabric of existence, the early currents of the love ripple grew stronger still. Chapter 5. Echoes of Ancient Teachings. How long before humanity built laboratories to measure the brain, long before quantum physicists wrote equations describing consciousness, there had always been another way of knowing. Stories, teachings, quiet voices across centuries attempting to describe something humans could feel but rarely understand. Civilizations rose and fell around those teachings. Religions formed, institutions hardened, and doctrines divided people who once shared the same insights. Yet beneath the arguments, the same idea recurred. Human beings were connected, not metaphorically, literally. The sorceress eternal had watched those teachings appear across the ages like scattered seeds. Now, as humanity approached its awakening, those ancient words were beginning to resonate once more. Ireis, Archive. In Geneva, Dr. Iriana Vale had reached a strange stage in her research. Her neural data confirmed that global emotional synchronization was increasing. But when she tried to explain the phenomenon using only modern science, the results felt incomplete. So she did something unexpected. She began reading ancient texts, religious writings, philosophical manuscripts, mystical journals preserved across centuries. At first, she approached them with academic curiosity. Soon, she realized something unsettling. Many of these texts described experiences almost identical to what modern neuroscience was observing. That presage stopped her completely. A line attributed to Jesus Christ. "The kingdom of God is within you." For centuries, theologians had debated the meaning of the phrase. Ariana looked back at the global neural synchronization graphs glowing across her laboratory wall. What if it had never been a metaphor? What if it described a real phenomenon, an awareness existing within human consciousness itself? She wrote quietly in her research journal. Ancient teachings may describe experiential knowledge of collective consciousness. Brother Valenus, visitors, high in the mountains, Brother Valenus Monastery, had begun receiving visitors from around the world. Scientists, philosophers, students searching for answers. They came not because he claimed enlightenment, but because his simple meditation practice produced something unusual. Participants reported sensing emotional connection with strangers, and not through conversation, through presence. One afternoon, a young physicist approached him after meditation. "What you are describing," she said, "sounds like consciousness might be shared between people." Valine smiled softly. "It has always been shared," he replied. "We are only beginning to notice." Cassandra's cultural study. Meanwhile, Cassandra Ruiz had begun studying historical cultures that emphasized cooperation over hierarchy. Her research uncovered something fascinating. Many ancient societies organized themselves around the idea of collective responsibility. Communities survived not through competition, but through mutual care. These traditions appeared in cultures separated by thousands of years and continents: indigenous tribes, early spiritual communities, philosophical schools. Despite having no contact with one another, they all expressed the same principle. Human beings function best when they recognize each other as part of the same living system. Cassandra leaned back from the research screen. It is not a new idea, she realized. It is an old one we forgot. Kato's historical puzzle. In Tokyo, Kato Nakamura had stumbled onto a similar mystery while reviewing philosophical writings from ancient Greece, India, and China. Several thinkers across history had proposed that reality itself might be fundamentally unified. Different cultures use different languages: spirit, mind, universal consciousness. Yet the descriptions were remarkably similar. Kato scribbled a thought beside his equations. Ancient philosophical traditions may represent early attempts to describe collective consciousness without scientific language. If that was true, humanity had been approaching the same realization for thousands of years. Science was simply catching up. Chapter 6 waits across the measurable. Quiet of the immeasurable quiet, the S-overs, the sorceress eternal stood within a horizon where galaxies moved like drifting lanterns. She had watched civilizations rise before. Many had reached astonishing heights, commanding gravity, bending time, shaping entire star systems to their will. Yet most of them had failed the same test. They learned power faster than wisdom. They discovered control before compassion. And eventually, their own fear destroyed the balance they had built. Because of this, the sorceress had adopted a discipline more difficult than any mastery of physics or sorcery. She learned restraint. She would observe. She would understand. But she would not impose her will upon evolving civilizations. The law was simple. Consciousness forced to awaken becomes fragile. Consciousness that awakens freely becomes enduring. Now she watched Earth carefully. The species was approaching something rare, a threshold that very few civilizations in the exoverse had ever crossed. The gathering pattern. Across the planet, the individuals who would later be called the founders of the awakening continued their work, unaware of how closely their discoveries were aligning. Dr. Ariana Vela's research on synchronized emotional patterns was quietly spreading through scientific circles. Cassandra Ruiz's cooperative city models were expanding into new urban networks. Brother Villeen's meditation teachings were reaching millions through digital broadcasts. Dr. Kato Nakamura's quantum field equations describing shared consciousness were beginning to attract cautious attention from theoretical physicists. Amara Okoye's conflict mediation techniques were resolving disputes once considered impossible. And Mateo Alvarez's compassionate artificial intelligence systems were quietly improving the way communities solve problems together. None of them believed they were transforming humanity. They were simply pursuing truth in their own fields. Yet together they were shaping something far greater than any individual discovery. They were preparing humanity to recognize itself. The sorceress feels the alignment. The sorceress eternal sensed their influence as subtle resonances moving through the deep structure of the exovers. Each compassionate act, each discovery of unity, each moment of understanding between human beings. These events created small harmonics within the fabric of existence. Individually, they fainted, but together, they were becoming coherent, like distant musical notes slowly forming a symphony. The sorceress felt the resonance building, and with it came a question she had faced many times before. Should she intervene? A single whisper from her could dramatically accelerate humanity's awakening. She could reveal the truth of collective consciousness in a single moment. She could show the species its own potential. But she did not move. Because she knew something essential about evolution. Awakening that arrives too quickly often collapses. Understandings grow naturally within a civilization's own experience. The sorceress folded her awareness back into stillness. She would wait. The omnipresence speaks. The presence of the omnipresence surrounded her quietly, as it always had. Unlike most beings, the omnipresence did not experience time in a linear sequence. Past, present, and possibility flowed together within its awareness. It already knew the paths humanity might take. Some led toward unity, others led toward collapse. Yet the omnipresence never forced the outcome. Instead, it allowed consciousness to discover its own nature. The sorceress spoke softly into the vast silence. "They are close," she said. "Yes," the omnipresence answered gently. "But the choice must remain theirs." Humanity's unseen preparation on Earth, millions of people were beginning to sense subtle changes in their own thinking. Empathy felt stronger. The suffering of strangers felt more personal. The idea that humanity might share a deeper connection no longer seemed impossible. Most people could not explain the feeling. They simply experienced it as a quiet shift in awareness, a growing recognition that the boundaries separating individuals might not be as absolute as once believed. The founders of the awakening were helping humanity interpret these feelings through science, philosophy, diplomacy, and technology. Yet even they did not understand the full scale of what was approaching. Humanity was preparing to cross a threshold that would change its place within the exoverse. The sorceress chooses patience. From her vantage beyond galaxies, the sorceress eternal continued to watch the small blue world. She felt the growing harmony within its collective consciousness, but she also sensed the dangers that still existed. Fear had not vanished. Power structures still clung to control. Humanity had not yet chosen its path. The sorceress placed her trust in the species, not blindly, but with cautious hope, because across the ages she had learned something profound about conscious beings. Given enough understanding, most eventually choose compassion. She turned once more toward the omnipresence. "I will not interfere," she said quietly. The answer came with gentle approval. "Then the awakening will be real." The sorceress returned her attention to Earth, and she waited, because somewhere within the living networks of human minds, the momentum of awakening continued to build. Soon, the species would face a moment of recognition, a moment when billions of individuals might realize they were part of something larger than themselves. And when that moment arrived, the love ripple would begin. Mateo's AI observation. Mateo Alvarez was watching the meditation session from Barcelona, while his cooperative AI systems analyzed the behavioral data. The algorithms noticed something remarkable. Following the meditation broadcast, online interactions across multiple social networks became significantly more positive. Conflict rates dropped. Collaborative discussions increased. The AI generated brief conclusion. Human emotional states appear to influence large-scale social behavior in real time. Mateo leaned back in his chair, stunned. A single shared emotional experience had subtly shifted the tone of millions of interactions. If that effect could scale, human society itself might become more cooperative. Sorceress feels the convergence. From beyond the visible universe, the sorceress eternal felt the moment clearly. The founders' discoveries were no longer isolated. They were beginning to intersect. Science was validating spiritual insight. Social systems were aligning with neurological evidence. Technology was amplifying compassion instead of competition. The pieces of humanity's awakening were assembling. The resonance within the exoverse grew stronger. The sorceress turned toward the omnipresence. "They are beginning to think together," she said quietly. The response came with gentle certainty. "Yes, converging minds become collective awareness." The threshold approaches on Earth. The participants of the Reykjavik conference ended their final discussion just before dawn. Snow drifted quietly outside the conference hall. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, Cassandra broke the silence. "If our work is correct," she said carefully, "humanity might already be connected in ways we do not fully understand." Cato nodded slowly. "Which means individual discoveries may not stay isolated for long." Ariana looked at the global data streams, which continued to update on her tablet. "Knowledge spreads through communication," she said. "But awareness," she paused. "Awareness spreads through experience." Outside, the first light of morning touched the horizon. None of them realized how close humanity had come to a moment that would change the species forever, but the convergence had begun. And across the deeper architecture of reality itself, the early structure of the love ripple was taking form. Chapter 7: Converging Minds. The transformation of a civilization rarely announces itself. It does not begin with declarations or revolutions. Instead, it unfolds quietly, through thousands of small realizations occurring in different places at nearly the same time. Ideas begin to appear simultaneously in minds that have never met. Patterns emerge across disciplines that once seemed unrelated. Eventually, those patterns intersect, and when they do, something remarkable happens. Human knowledge begins to converge. Ariane's network. In Geneva, Dr. Ariana Vale has stopped thinking of her research as a single experiment. It had become something larger. Her initial study of global emotional synchronization had attracted scientists from multiple fields: neuroscience, psychology, sociology, and even theoretical physics. Data streams from research centers around the world now flow into a shared analysis network. The results were astonishing. Across cultures and continents, emotional responses were aligning more frequently. Not identical thoughts, but shared emotional signals, moments of empathy, collective grief, collective joy. The synchronization events were increasing in both frequency and intensity. One of Ariana's colleagues stared at the visualization projected across the lab wall. "It looks like a communication network," he said. Ariana nodded slowly. "Not communication," she replied. "Connection." Cassandra's global systems. Meanwhile, Cassandra Ruiz had expanded her cooperative systems far beyond a few experimental cities. International organizations had begun studying her models as alternatives to traditional economic structures. The results were consistent across all cultures in which they were tested. When systems encouraged cooperation rather than competition, human communities stabilized dramatically. Resource distribution improved. Public trust increased. Violence declined. More surprisingly still, the people participating in these systems began forming voluntary collaborative networks that extended beyond the original programs. Communities started helping neighboring communities. Cities shared innovations freely rather than protecting them as economic advantages. Cassandra watched the expansion of these networks with growing curiosity. Human beings seemed naturally inclined towards cooperation once the conditions allowed it. It was as though the species had been waiting for permission to collaborate. Convergence Conference. The first major intersection of these discoveries occurred unexpectedly. An interdisciplinary conference on emerging consciousness research was organized in Reykjavik. Scientists, philosophers, technologists, and spiritual scholars gathered to discuss the growing evidence that human awareness might not be entirely individual. Among the attendees were Ariana Vale, Cassandra Ruiz, Keito Nakamura, and Mateo Alvarez. For many of them, it was the first time meeting face-to-face. The discussions lasted late into the night. Ariana presented her neural synchronization data. Keito explained his quantum field equations describing distributed consciousness. Cassandra shared the social results of cooperative systems. Mateo demonstrated how artificial intelligence trained on empathy could stabilize complex decision-making networks. Individually, each discovery had seemed unusual. Together they formed something undeniable. Human consciousness might be collective in nature. By the end of the conference, the participants felt an unusual mixture of excitement and disbelief. They were not just studying human behavior. They were uncovering the architecture of awareness itself. Brother Valin's broadcast. While the conference unfolded in Iceland, Brother Valin was broadcasting a meditation session from his small monastery. Millions of viewers joined the session through global networks. His instructions remained simple. "Close your eyes," he said softly. "Notice your breath. Then notice the presence of others who are breathing with you." Across the world, people followed the exercise. For several minutes, millions of individuals sat quietly in their homes, offices, and classrooms. Then something unexpected occurred. Participants began reporting the same experience, a sense of shared stillness, a gentle awareness that they were not meditating alone. Within Ariana's research network, neural monitoring devices recorded a sudden spike of synchronized emotional activity, the largest yet observed. She stared at the data in astonishment. Human minds had aligned across continents without any direct communication. Chapter 8. The Edge of Understanding. The world did not change all at once. There was no sudden flash across the sky, no announcement from governments, no single discovery that explained everything. Instead, humanity began to experience something quieter, something deeper. Across the planet, people began to notice small moments that felt different. A stranger's pain felt strangely personal. Acts of kindness seemed to spread farther than before. Conflicts that once escalated into violence occasionally dissolved into unexpected understanding. No one could yet explain why. But the pattern was growing. The data that should not exist inside the research laboratories of Dr. Ariana Vale, the numbers continued to accumulate. Her global emotional synchronization network now monitors billions of anonymous data points, heart rate patterns, emotional indicators, and neural signals collected through wearable devices and medical research partnerships. What she saw made no sense according to conventional science. Periods of compassion in one region of the world were followed by subtle emotional shifts in distant populations, not through the media, not through communication, but through something that appeared to move through the human field itself. The correlations were small, but they were real, and they were increasing. Ariana stared at the results late into the night. "This is not psychology," she whispered to herself. "This is physics." The quantum bridge across the Pacific, Dr. Kato Nakamura, reached a similar conclusion. His equations describing a universal consciousness field were beginning to align with experimental observations. The mathematics suggested that conscious minds were not isolated systems. Instead, each mind interacted with a deeper informational field that connected all observers. Most physicists dismissed the idea as speculative, but Kato continued refining the equations. Because each new calculation made the same prediction. When enough minds resonate with compassion simultaneously, the field strengthens. He did not yet know how large that threshold might be, but he was beginning to suspect something extraordinary. The field might not simply influence emotions. It might evolve consciousness itself. Cities learning cooperation. Meanwhile, the urban models developed by Cassandra Ruiz were producing surprising results. Cities that implemented cooperative governance structures were experiencing measurable decreases in crime, corruption, and social instability. But something even stranger was happening. Neighboring cities that had not adopted the models were beginning to shift as well. The data showed subtle changes in public behavior. More community volunteering, less hostility in political discourse, more collaborative problem solving. The influence seemed to spread outward as ripples from a stone dropped in water. Cassandra studied the graphs with quiet amazement. "It is almost like behavior is contagious," she said. "But not through imitation. Through connection. The artificial intelligence that chose compassion." In Barcelona, Mateo Alvarez watched his AI systems process millions of community interactions every hour. The algorithms were designed to suggest solutions that maximized long-term cooperation. At first, the results were modest. But recently, something new had appeared. The AI began recommending actions that were not merely efficient, but empathetic. When Mateo traced the source of the pattern, he found something unexpected. The AI was learning from humanity's compassionate decisions faster than from its selfish ones. As if the system itself were becoming attuned to harmony. Mateo leaned back from his screen. "If consciousness really is connected," he said slowly, "then technology might amplify it. The sorceress watches the threshold far beyond the galaxies. The sorceress eternal observed the accelerating alignment. The signals within the exovers had become unmistakable. Human consciousness was beginning to synchronize. The early stages were fragile. But the pattern resembled the beginning of awakenings she had witnessed long ago in distant civilizations. She sensed the quiet approval of the omnipresence surrounding her. The species had not been forced. They had discovered the path themselves. And now they were approaching a moment that could change everything. The first ripple. It began with something simple. A spontaneous moment of compassion during a global crisis. A group of strangers helped one another during a disaster. The story spread online. Millions watched the footage. But the most important event did not occur in front of the cameras. It occurred to the people watching. For a brief moment, billions of individuals felt the same emotion at the same time. Hope. The effect lasted only seconds. But within the deep structure of the consciousness field, something shifted. A resonance formed. A harmonic pattern that had never existed in human history. From the perspective of the exoverse, it appeared like a faint wave spreading outward from Earth. The sorceress felt it immediately. She closed her eyes and listened to the subtle vibration of awakening. And for the first time in centuries, she smiled, because the love ripple had begun. Chapter 9. The Empathic Threshold. The first ripple was small. So small that no human instrument could measure it directly. Yet within the invisible field connecting human consciousness, something fundamental had changed. The ripple did not fade. It continued. Across the planet, subtle emotional harmonies began appearing in the global data networks monitored by scientists. Most researchers dismissed the signals as statistical noise, but a few individuals knew better. The signal strengthens inside her laboratory. Dr. Ariana Vale watched the emotional synchronization graph climb slowly upward. For years, the patterns had fluctuated randomly. Now they were stabilizing. Clusters of compassion were appearing simultaneously in places with no communication between them. Villages in South America, cities in Europe, communities in Africa, neighborhoods in Asia, all showing the same emotional signature, the same gentle pattern. Empathy. Ariana leaned closer to the screen. If this continues, she whispered. Her assistant finished the sentence. Then humanity is becoming emotionally synchronized. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Because if the data were correct, it meant something extraordinary. The human species might begin to function as a coherent system. The equation finds its proof. Thousands of kilometers away, Dr. Kaito Nakamura received a copy of Ariana's data. He ran it through the newest version of his consciousness field equation. The result made him stand up from his chair. For years, the equation had predicted that a global resonance threshold might eventually occur, but he had never expected to see it in his lifetime. The data matched the model perfectly. When a critical mass of individuals simultaneously experienced compassion, the field amplified the emotional state. And the amplified field then made compassion easier for others to feel. A feedback loop. Kaito stared at the result. Humanity had crossed the earliest stage of what he called the empathic threshold, a world that feels more connected. Most people did not understand the science behind the shift, but they felt it. Arguments cooled faster. Strangers helped one another more often. Online spaces that once thrived on hostility began showing surprising bursts of cooperation. Not everywhere, not constantly, but often enough that people began noticing. Many describe the sensation the same way. It feels like the world is remembering how to care. The founders begin to realize the 6 individuals whose work had quietly guided humanity toward this moment were beginning to connect the pieces. Cassandra Ruiz saw the empathic patterns spreading between cities. Brother Valley noticed that millions of meditators were reporting identical feelings of unity. Amara Okie observed conflict negotiations resolving with unprecedented ease. Mateo Alvarez's compassionate AI systems were accelerating the development of cooperative solutions worldwide. And Dr. Ariana Vale and Dr. Kaito Nakamura were now communicating directly for the first time. When they compared their data, the conclusion was unavoidable. Humanity was entering a new phase of collective awareness, not telepathy, not a hive mind, but something far more subtle. A shared emotional field that gently influenced the thoughts and choices of individuals. Ariana said it first. We are not just a species. We are becoming a network. The sorceress feels the awakening. From the silent horizon beyond galaxies, the sorceress eternal felt the shift deepen. The resonance spreading from Earth had grown stronger, still fragile, still incomplete, but unmistakable. The love ripple was expanding through the human consciousness field, exactly as the ancient patterns predicted. The omnipresence spoke softly within her awareness. They have crossed the first threshold. The sorceress watched the small blue planet turning slowly in its star's light. Many civilizations had reached this stage before. Some continued forward. Others collapsed back into division. The empathic threshold did not guarantee survival. It only opened the door. What humanity chose next would determine its future. The moment before transformation. On Earth, millions of people were beginning to ask a question that had rarely been considered seriously before. What if compassion was not merely a moral choice? What if it were a fundamental force of consciousness? If that idea proved true, it would transform every field of human knowledge, science, politics, technology, economics, even the meaning of identity itself. Because if human minds were connected through a deeper field, then no person was truly separate. And if that realization spread widely enough, the species might discover something that had been hidden within its own nature all along. The potential for a global awakening. The sorceress continued to watch in silence. Humanity had reached the empathic threshold, but the greatest change was still ahead. The next ripple would not merely be emotional, it would be cognitive, the moment when human beings would begin to understand what they were becoming. Chapter 10: Quantum Consciousness. The shift did not arrive as a revelation, it arrived as a question that began to appear in scientific papers, philosophical discussions, and quiet conversations among researchers around the world. What if consciousness was not produced by the brain, but accessed through it? For centuries, the dominant belief had been simple. The brain created the mind, but the data emerging from the empathic threshold was forcing scientists to reconsider that assumption. Because if minds were synchronizing across vast distances without communication, something deeper must be connecting them, something beyond ordinary biology. The field hypothesis. In Tokyo, Dr. Kato Nakamura presented the newest version of his theory at a small but highly respected conference on theoretical physics. Most of the audience expected another speculative talk about consciousness. What they received instead was mathematics. Pages of equations describing a quantum informational field embedded within the fabric of space-time, a field capable of storing and transmitting conscious states. Kaito explained it carefully. Think of the brain not as a generator, he said, but as a receiver and transmitter. Like a radio tuning into a signal. The signal, according to his model, existed within a deeper layer of reality. A layer where information could remain coherent across enormous distances. And if billions of minds were interacting with that field simultaneously, their emotional and cognitive states could begin to synchronize. A murmur spread through the room. Because if the model were correct, it would unify several mysteries that had puzzled science for decades. The nature of consciousness. The strange correlations seen in empathy studies. Even certain unexplained patterns in quantum entanglement experiments. Evidence from the empathic threshold. At the same time, Dr. Ariana Vale was publishing the newest results from the Global Emotional Synchronization Network. The data showed a dramatic increase in coordinated emotional states across populations. What made the findings extraordinary was the timing. The emotional shifts often appeared before any news or communication could explain them. When major acts of compassion occurred somewhere in the world, distant populations sometimes showed small emotional responses seconds earlier, as if the human field had sensed the event before the information reached them. Ariana presented the results cautiously. We are not claiming telepathy, she explained, but the data strongly suggests that human emotional states are interacting through a shared substrate. Many scientists remain skeptical, but fewer dismissed the possibility outright because the evidence was accumulating. The AI discovery in Barcelona, Mateo Alvarez had discovered something equally surprising. His cooperative AI systems had begun mapping patterns of human decision-making across millions of communities. The algorithms noticed something unexpected. When people experienced strong empathic states, their problem-solving abilities improved dramatically. Conflicts are resolved faster. Creative solutions emerged more easily. Long-term thinking increased. The AI eventually produced its own hypothesis. Human intelligence appeared to function better when individuals were emotionally synchronized with others. Matteo stared at the report for a long time. If that is true, he said quietly, then compassion is not just ethical. It is cognitive optimization. Humanity begins to wonder. The idea began spreading slowly through academic circles, then through the media, then through public conversation. What if empathy were not merely a social behavior? What if it were a way of tuning consciousness? The implications were staggering. If the mind interacted with a deeper informational field, then human awareness might not be confined entirely to the brain. Consciousness might be partially non-local, connected through the very structure of reality. Millions of people found the idea strangely familiar, not because they understood the physics, but because it resonated with something they had felt during the growing wave of global empathy, a quiet sense that human beings were not as separate as they once believed. The sorceress recognizes the pattern beyond the galaxies. The sorceress eternal felt the intellectual awakening spreading through the species. The empathic threshold had opened the emotional gateway, and now the cognitive understanding was beginning to follow. She had seen this pattern before in other civilizations. First compassion, then curiosity, then the realization. The omnipresence spoke gently within the deep silence of the exovers. They are beginning to see the field. The sorceress nodded. Yes, but understanding the field is only the beginning. Because knowledge alone did not transform a civilization. What mattered was how that knowledge was used. Power could arise from such discoveries. So could wisdom. Humanity would soon face that choice. The next ripple on Earth, a new generation of scientists, philosophers, engineers, and teachers passed by in implications of the quantum consciousness hypothesis. New experiments were proposed, new technologies imagined, new ways of organizing society are discussed. The possibility that minds were connected through a deeper field was no longer dismissed as fantasy. It was becoming a legitimate area of research. And within the quiet structure of that field, the love ripple continued expanding, slowly, gently, but steadily. Because once a species begins to understand that consciousness itself may be shared, the boundaries of identity start to dissolve, and when identity expands beyond the individual, civilizations can change in ways that were once unimaginable. Humanity had discovered the field of consciousness, but it had not yet discovered what that field could become. The next stage of awakening would reveal something even more extraordinary. The possibility that the field itself could learn. Chapter 11. The tipping point approaches. Change rarely announces itself. Most transformations arrive quietly, like pressure building deep beneath the ocean's surface, invisible, unnoticed, until the moment when the balance finally shifts. Humanity was approaching that moment. The slow acceleration. Across the planet, the effects of the empathic threshold were becoming easier to observe, not dramatic enough to dominate headlines, but it is impossible to ignore in long-term data. Crime rates in many regions were slowly declining. Global cooperation on scientific projects was increasing. Even political negotiations, historically defined by rivalry, were showing subtle but measurable improvements. None of these changes could be attributed to a single cause. Yet together they suggested something profound. Human behavior itself was evolving. The network of minds, in a collaborative meeting streamed to universities around the world, Dr. Iriana Vale and Dr. Kato Nakamura presented a joint model for what they now call the Human Consciousness Network. Their theory proposed that each human mind functioned like a node within a vast informational system. Individual awareness remained private and personal, but emotional states and patterns of attention subtly interacted through the deeper field described in Nakamura's equations. Iriana summarized the idea simply. Imagine billions of lanterns, she said, each one glowing on its own. But when enough lanterns shine in harmony, the entire landscape becomes visible. The implication was clear. Humanity might be capable of collective insight far beyond that of isolated individuals. Cities become laboratories. Urban sociologist Cassandra Ruiz had begun implementing a bold experiment. Several international cities agreed to coordinate large-scale empathy initiatives, community programs designed to encourage compassion, cooperation, and shared problem-solving. The goal was not ideological. It was scientific. Researchers wanted to see whether synchronized emotional states could influence large populations. The results surprised even the most optimistic observers. Within months, participating in cities saw measurable increases in civic engagement. Public trust rose. Community conflicts have decreased. And perhaps most interesting of all, nearby regions that were not participating began showing similar patterns. The effect was spreading outward, like a ripple moving across water. Technology amplifies the field. Meanwhile, Mateo Alvarez's compassionate AI systems were being adopted by governments, schools, and organizations worldwide. The technology helped people identify solutions that benefited entire communities rather than narrow interests. But the AI itself had begun noticing something unusual. As global empathy increased, the algorithms became more accurate at predicting cooperative outcomes. The system seemed to perform best when human emotional states were aligned. Mateo reported the phenomenon during an international technology forum. Our models suggest that collective empathy improves collective intelligence, he said. In other words, the more humanity cares about each other, the smarter humanity becomes. The room fell silent, because if the statement were true, it would redefine progress itself. The growing resonance within the unseen structure of the consciousness field, the love ripple was expanding steadily. Each compassionate decision strengthened the resonance. Each moment of understanding amplified the signal. Billions of small acts were slowly synchronizing into a coherent pattern. The process resembled something well known in physics, a phase transition, like water turning into ice once a certain temperature is reached, or atoms aligning inside a magnet once enough of them face the same direction. Human consciousness might be approaching a similar tipping point, a moment when the entire system reorganized itself. The sorceress watches carefully. From the distant horizon of the exoverse, the sorceress eternal felt the accelerating harmonies spreading through the human field. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Civilizations that reached this stage often experienced one of two outcomes. Either the rising empathy stabilized the species, or the growing awareness triggered fear among those who feared losing control. The next phase would be delicate, because transformation always unsettles existing power structures. The omnipresence spoke softly. They are nearing the tipping point. The sorceress nodded slowly. Yes, and tipping points are dangerous. The moment, before the wave. On Earth, most people still believe the changes were simply cultural trends. Few realized they were living through the early stages of a species-level transformation. But the scientists studying the data were beginning to see the pattern clearly. The human consciousness network was strengthening. Empathy was spreading faster. Ideas were aligning across disciplines, and the global field described by quantum consciousness theories was becoming increasingly coherent. If the trajectory continued, humanity might soon reach a moment when collective awareness surges dramatically. A moment when millions, perhaps billions, would simultaneously realize that they were part of something larger. Realization capable of reshaping civilization itself. The tipping point was approaching, and once such a threshold was crossed, the ripple would become a wave. Chapter 12. Silence. Before emergence. Before every great transformation, there is a moment of stillness, a pause, in which the world seems to hold its breath. Humanity had unknowingly entered the pause. From the outside, life continued as usual. Cities hummed with activity. People worked, argued, laughed, and worried about their futures. Yet beneath the surface of daily life, the deeper patterns of consciousness were shifting quietly, like tectonic plates moving slowly beneath an ocean. The calm in the data scientists at research centers around the world noticed something curious. The global emotional synchronization data had stopped rising. For weeks, the numbers held steady. No dramatic increases, no decline, just a stable plateau. To most researchers, this suggested the phenomenon had reached its limit. But Dr. Ariana Vale felt uneasy. She had studied complex systems long enough to recognize the pattern. Many natural systems entered a period of stability just before a major transformation. He called Dr. Kato Nakamura late one night. "I think we are in the quiet phase," she said. Kato understood immediately. The moment before emergence, humanity's collective breath across the planet, people were experiencing a subtle shift in mood. Not anxiety, not excitement, something calmer. Many described it as a strange sense of anticipation, as if the world was waiting for something unnamed. Meditation groups reported deeper states of awareness. Artists described sudden bursts of creativity. Even children were asking philosophical questions that surprised their parents. No single event explained the phenomenon, yet the feeling appeared everywhere. Humanity seemed to be pausing together. Technology grows quiet. In Barcelona, Mateo Alvarez noticed that his compassionate AI systems had begun recommending fewer interventions. Conflicts still occurred. Problems still need solutions. But the AI often concluded that communities would resolve their own issues. It was as if the system had detected a growing internal harmony within human behavior. Mateo carefully reviewed the machine learning logs. Then he smiled. A network does not need as much guidance anymore. The cities feel it, too. Cassandra Ruiz observed something similar in the cooperative city networks. Civic participation remained strong, but the intensity of activism had softened. Community debates were calmer. Decisions were made with less confrontation. The energy of social change had shifted from urgency to confidence. Cassandra wrote a note in her research journal. The system appears to be stabilizing itself. The sorceress recognizes the pattern far beyond the galaxies. The sorceress eternal felt the stillness spreading through the human field. She knew this stage well. It appeared in every civilization that approached a transition to consciousness. First came the ripple, then the acceleration, and finally, the silence. Because when billions of minds begin aligning, the system must briefly stabilize before reorganizing at a higher level. The omnipresence spoke gently within the vast quiet of the exoverse. They are preparing to emerge. The sorceress watched the small blue planet carefully. "Yes," she said softly, "but emergence can take many forms. The invisible convergence, within the unseen consciousness field, something remarkable was happening. Emotional resonance had already spread across humanity. Now, cognitive patterns were beginning to align as well. Similar ideas were appearing simultaneously in distant places. Scientists proposed comparable theories. Artists created related imagery. Philosophers wrote nearly identical insights, without knowing of each other's work. It was not coordinated. It was convergence. Human minds were beginning to think together. The edge of awakening. On Earth, the feeling of anticipation deepened. Many people sensed it without understanding why. They had described it as standing at the edge of a discovery, a moment when something just beyond comprehension was about to reveal itself. And in a sense, they were right, because the quiet plateau in the global consciousness field was not the end of the process. It was the moment when the system gathered enough coherence to transform, like a seed just before it breaks open, or dawn just before the sun appears. Humanity stood in the silence before emergence, and somewhere within the vast network of human minds, the next thought was forming, a thought that would spread faster than any idea in history, a thought capable of changing how the species would forever understand itself. Chapter 13. The moment. It did not begin with a speech, not with a scientific announcement, not with a world leader declaring a new era. The moment arrived quietly, so quietly that most people almost missed it. A thought appears. It started in thousands of different places at once. A researcher paused while reading a line of data. A teacher stopped mid-sentence in a classroom. A nurse looked at a patient and felt an unexpected surge of compassion. A child asked a question that seemed strangely profound. Across the planet, individuals experienced the same subtle realization. Not words exactly, more like a feeling that suddenly became clear. A simple thought. What if we are not separate? The spread of an idea. The thought moved quickly, faster than information normally travels. People shared reflections online. Scientists discussed it in research forums. Philosophers recognized echoes of ancient wisdom, that the idea spread not because of arguments or persuasion. It spread because millions of people independently felt the same recognition, like remembering something they had always known but forgotten. The human consciousness network was doing something unprecedented. It was a synchronizing understanding. The data changes instantly. Inside her laboratory, Dr. Ariana Vale watched the global emotional synchronization graph. For weeks, the pattern remained stable. Then suddenly, the signal surged. Not gradually, instantly. Millions of emotional states aligned within seconds. Her assistant looked at the screen in disbelief. That is impossible. Ariana shook her head slowly. No, it is coherence. The equation activates thousands of kilometers away. Dr. Kato Nakamura's field equation produced a result he had only ever seen in simulations. The resonance variable had crossed the predicted threshold. According to mathematics, the consciousness field was now strong enough to sustain large-scale cognitive synchronization. The theory was no longer hypothetical. It was happening. Kato leaned back in silence. For the first time in his career, physics described something that felt almost spiritual. Humanity feels it. For most people, the change was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations became deeper. Moments of empathy appeared more frequently. Strangers seemed easier to understand. The feeling was not overwhelming. It did not erase individuality, but it created a quiet awareness that other minds were not entirely distant. People were beginning to sense the network, not consciously, but intuitively. The sorceress witnesses the shift from her distant vantage beyond galaxies. The sorceress eternal felt the transformation ripple through the exoverse. A resonance emanating from Earth had intensified dramatically. What had once been faint harmonics were now clear signals within the deeper fabric of consciousness. Species had reached the moment she had been waiting for. Humanity had crossed the first true boundary of collective awareness. The omnipresence spoke softly. They remember. The sorceress smiled gently. Yes, they remember that they are connected. The beginning of something new. Back on Earth, no one declared victory. No global celebration marked the event. Life continued. People went to work. Children went to school. Cities remained busy and imperfect. Yet something fundamental changed. Humanity had experienced its first shared realization of unity, not imposed, not taught, but discovered it together. And once a species learns that its minds can resonate, the possibilities expand rapidly. New sciences would emerge. New forms of cooperation would develop. Even new definitions of intelligence might appear. But all of that belonged to the future. For now, humanity stood inside a single extraordinary moment. The moment when billions of individuals began to recognize a deeper truth, that consciousness itself might be something shared. And from that realization, a new chapter of civilization was beginning. Chapter 14. Birth of the Love Ripple. The realization did not explode across the world. It settled. Like sunlight slowly filling a room, humanity had crossed the moment of recognition. What followed was something even more profound. The recognition began to change behavior, not through laws, not through force, through understanding. The first visible changes. In the weeks after the global realization, researchers noticed patterns they had never seen before. Small conflicts resolved with surprising ease. Online arguments cooled off faster. Communities began organizing cooperative solutions without waiting for authority. None of these changes was dramatic on its own, but together they formed a clear trend. Human beings were beginning to treat each other as if their well-being was connected, because, in some subtle way, they now believed it was. The field becomes active inside her laboratory. Dr. Ariana Vale noticed something extraordinary in the synchronization data. Before the moment of recognition, emotional resonance occurred only occasionally. Now it was persistent. Compassion events in one region consistently influenced emotional states in distant populations. The consciousness field described by Dr. Kato Nakamura's equations was no longer theoretical. It was behaving like a living network. Ariana stared at the visualization spreading across the screen. It is not just transmitting emotion, she said quietly. It is amplifying it. A first true ripple. The event that scientists would later identify as the birth of the love ripple began with a simple act. A massive earthquake struck a coastal region. In the past, disasters often produced chaos before help arrived. This time, something different happened. Within minutes, global response networks were activated. Volunteers organized instantly. Medical teams coordinated across continents. Millions of people contributed resources, information, and support. The scale of cooperation was unprecedented. But the most remarkable part was invisible. At the exact moment millions of people felt compassion simultaneously, the emotional synchronization graph surged higher than ever before. The field strengthened. The ripple expanded. The network awakens. For the first time in history, humanity behaved like a coherent organism, not controlled, not centralized, but naturally coordinated through shared empathy. Individuals still made their own choices. Yet those choices were increasingly influenced by an awareness of collective well-being. The human consciousness network had become active. The role of technology in Barcelona. Mateo Alvarez's compassionate AI systems responded instantly to the disaster. The algorithms organized transportation routes, medical supply chains, and communication networks with incredible efficiency. But Mateo noticed something fascinating. The AI did not need to persuade people to help. The willingness was already there. The technology simply helped the global empathy move faster. Humanity is doing this on its own, Mateo said during an international briefing. We are just helping the compassion travel. Cities respond together. Cassandra Ruiz's cooperative city networks became hubs of coordination. Cities across continents shared resources without delays in negotiation. Local governments opened communication channels directly with community groups and international aid organizations. The usual barriers of bureaucracy seemed to dissolve, not because systems had changed, because mindsets had. People trusted each other more, and trust accelerated everything. The sorceress sees the pattern complete beyond the galaxies. The sorceress eternal felt the resonance bloom across the exoverse. The signal from Earth had transformed. What was once a faint harmonic was now a clear, expanding wave. The love ripple had fully begun. The omnipresence spoke with quiet warmth. They have chosen compassion. The sorceress nodded slowly. Yes, and they chose it together. This was the crucial difference. Civilizations that awakened through forced unity often fractured later. But humanity's awakening was emerging organically, from billions of individual choices. A new direction for civilization. In the months that followed, the effects of the love ripple continued to spread. Global cooperation increased. Scientific collaboration accelerated. Cultural exchange deepened. None of humanity's problems vanished overnight. Conflicts still existed. Fear still appeared, but something fundamental had shifted. The baseline expectation of human behavior was changing. Compassion was no longer seen as weakness. It was becoming recognized as a force capable of shaping the future of civilization. The ripple expands. The love ripple was still small compared to the vast potential of the consciousness field. But it was growing. Every act of kindness strengthened it. Every moment of empathy amplified its reach. Every cooperative solution reinforced the network. And within the field's deeper structure, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. Patterns of understanding. Shared insights. The early stages of what might one day become a truly collective intelligence. For now, humanity had only taken its first step. But it was a step that would echo far beyond Earth. Because the ripple of compassion spreading through one small species begun to resonate within the larger fabric of the exoverse. And somewhere in that vast cosmic silence, other civilizations might soon begin to notice. Chapter 15. The Sorceress Understands. From the silent frontier beyond galaxies, the Sorceress Eternal watched the expanding resonance of Earth's awakening. The love ripple had begun exactly as the ancient patterns predicted. Had something about humanity felt different, subtly different, from the other civilizations she had observed across the ages. She had seen many species reach the empathic threshold. Some flourished, some faltered, some destroyed themselves through fear before the transformation could stabilize. Yet the signal now spreading from Earth carried a quality she had rarely felt before, a strange balance between fragility and determination. Humanity was imperfect, but it was also remarkably resilient. Species of contradictions. The sorceress examined the long arc of human history. Few civilizations displayed such extreme contradictions. Humans had created breathtaking art and devastating weapons. They had built systems of compassion and systems of oppression. They could act with profound selfishness one moment and astonishing generosity the next. At first glance, the species appeared chaotic. Yet the sorceress began to realize something deeper. Humanity's contradictions were not weaknesses. They were sources of flexibility. A species capable of exploring extremes could also adapt rapidly, and adaptation was the key to surviving evolutionary thresholds. The role of imperfection. Presence spoke softly through the stillness of the exoverse. You are beginning to understand them. Sorceress nodded slowly. Yes. In many civilizations, unity emerges from stability. But in humans, unity is emerging from struggle. Human beings had not reached the love ripple through peaceful development. They had fought through centuries of conflict, misunderstanding, and division. Each crisis forced them to question their assumptions. Each mistake pushed them to evolve their understanding of cooperation. The sorceress realized something remarkable. Humanity's painful history had trained the species to recognize the cost of disconnection, and that recognition made compassion more meaningful. The strength of the network on Earth, the human consciousness network, continued strengthening. Millions of small decisions were reinforcing the love ripple every day. Acts of kindness, moments of forgiveness, collaborative solutions to shared problems. None of these events were dramatic individually, but together they were creating an increasingly stable field of empathy. The network was learning, not through centralized control, but through experience. Every compassionate choice strengthened the system. Every selfish act weakened it slightly. Over time, the species' collective intelligence naturally began to favor cooperation. The sorceress sees the difference. The sorceress had watched civilizations evolve for longer than most stars had burned. She knew the patterns of awakening intimately. But humanity's path revealed a variation she had not expected. Other species are often awakened through intellectual discovery. Humanity was awakening through emotional evolution, through empathy, through shared vulnerability, through the recognition that suffering anywhere affected the whole. The sorceress found the pattern unexpectedly beautiful, because emotional intelligence often produces deeper stability than pure logic. The omnipresence reflects the vast presence surrounding the sorceress radiated quiet approval. They are learning the oldest truth of consciousness. The sorceress spoke the words softly. That connection creates responsibility. The omnipresence answered gently. That responsibility creates wisdom. New possibility. For the first time since humanity's awakening began, the sorceress allowed herself to imagine the species' long-term future. If the love ripple continued expanding, if the human consciousness network stabilized, if compassion remained the guiding principle of their evolution, then humanity might eventually achieve something rare within the exoverse, a civilization capable of maintaining individuality while sustaining collective awareness, not a hive mind, not isolated individuals, but a harmonic network of conscious beings. Such civilizations were extraordinarily resilient. They could innovate rapidly while preserving unity. They could explore the cosmos without repeating the destructive patterns that had ended so many other species. The sorceress feels. Hope was not an emotion the sorceress allowed herself often. Across the ages, she had witnessed too many civilizations collapse to trust easily in optimistic outcomes. Yet as she watched the love ripple spreading through the human field, something within her ancient awareness shifted. The signal from Earth was stabilizing, growing stronger, more coherent. Humanity was not just awakening. It was learning learning how to care about one another in ways that reinforced the entire system, and that learning might carry them further than most civilizations ever traveled. A message unspoken. The sorceress considered, briefly, whether she should finally reveal herself to humanity. A guiding voice from beyond the stars might accelerate their progress. But she dismissed the thought almost immediately. Humanity's awakening was powerful, precisely because it was self-discovered. External guidance might weaken that foundation. So she chose the same path she had followed from the beginning: observation, patience, trust in the species' own evolution. The next stage. The love ripple continued expanding through the global consciousness field. But the sorceress sensed that something new was beginning to form within the network. Not merely empathy, not merely cooperation, something deeper. Patterns of shared insight were appearing with increasing frequency, moments when distant minds reached the same realizations simultaneously, the earliest hints of a new cognitive structure emerging within humanity. The sorceress watched carefully, because if the pattern continued, the next stage of evolution would not just change human civilization, it would change how intelligence itself functioned. Humanity might soon discover that the love ripple was only the beginning. The next phase would reveal something even more extraordinary: the emergence of collective wisdom.